Before the dawn of civilization, Göbekli Tepe and the DNA truth. Archaeologists found, when they began excavating a series of limestone outcroppings on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey in 1994, the remains of a ceremonial complex built approximately 12,000 years ago, 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, and at a time when the textbooks said that human beings were nomadic hunter-gatherers, incapable of the organized effort required to quarry, transport, and erect multi-ton stone pillars. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, a Turkish phrase meaning potbelly hill, after the rounded shape of the mound. The lead archaeologist was Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, who recognized almost immediately that the flint tools and animal bones he was finding on the surface were far older than anything he had expected. The subsequent excavations he directed until his death in 2014, and that have continued under Turkish and international researchers since, revealed a complex of circular stone enclosures containing T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them reaching 6 meters in height and weighing up to 20 tons, whose surfaces were carved with remarkably detailed reliefs of animals, abstract symbols, and what appear to be stylized human figures. The discovery immediately posed a problem for the standard model of human prehistory, which held that complex monumental architecture requires a settled agricultural population capable of feeding a specialized workforce. Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture. The people who built it were, by every other line of evidence, hunter-gatherers. The site has been under active excavation for 30 years, only a fraction of it opened, and it continues to produce findings that challenge assumptions about the organizational capacities of pre-agricultural human societies. Either the standard model was wrong about what hunter-gatherers could accomplish, or Göbekli Tepe was built by a population in the process of inventing something new, and the DNA evidence now suggests which of those possibilities is closer to the truth. Genetic researchers found, when they analyzed ancient DNA from skeletal remains associated with the human populations of southeastern Anatolia during the period that Göbekli Tepe was active, that the builders of the world's oldest known monumental architecture belonged to a population that would go on to change the genetic and cultural landscape of most of the world. The Anatolian hunter-gatherers, who were the direct ancestors of the first farmers in Europe. The DNA work on early Anatolian populations, published by Johannes Krause, Wolfgang Haak, and their colleagues at the Max Planck Institute across multiple studies between 2015 and 2020, identified the genetic profile of the populations living in this region before, during, and after the Neolithic transition. The pre-agricultural Anatolian hunter-gatherers were a genetically distinct group from the Western hunter-gatherers of Europe and from the populations of Africa and the Levant. They were tall by the standards of the period, with skeletal robusticity indicating high levels of physical activity, and their mitochondrial and Y chromosome profiles show the genetic continuity between the early Holocene population and the farming communities that subsequently expanded westward into Europe. The skulls associated with sites in the Göbekli Tepe region include several specimens with unusual post-mortem modifications, deep incisions and partial removal of bone, that researchers have interpreted as evidence of a secondary burial or skull cult practice. Similar skull curation practices are documented at other early Neolithic sites in the Near East, including Jericho. The DNA analysis of these modified skulls, where material has been successfully extracted, confirms their biological affiliation with the broader Anatolian hunter-gatherer population. Archaeological evidence found on the carved surfaces of the T-pillars at Göbekli Tepe and at related sites in the region, including Karahan Tepe, and Taş Tepeler, all dated to the same broad period and now collectively described as the Taş Tepeler Cultural Complex, documents an artistic tradition of extraordinary sophistication, whose specific meanings are still being worked out by researchers. The T-pillars themselves appear to represent stylized human forms. Several have arms carved in low relief along their sides, converging on the pillar's central axis. Carved belts or loincloths appear around the lower section of some pillars, as if indicating a waist. The pillars have heads, the upper horizontal section of the T, but no faces. They are human in outline and posture, but abstract in execution, suggesting that the builders were depicting powerful entities of some kind that were understood as humanoid without being straightforwardly portraits of individuals. The animal carvings that cover many pillar surfaces are anything but abstract. Foxes, boars, cranes, ducks, snakes, scorpions, and lions are rendered with a naturalistic precision that documents the builders' close daily familiarity with the fauna of their environment. The frequency and placement of specific animals appears to vary systematically between enclosures, leading researchers to propose that different enclosures may have served different ritual purposes or been associated with different social groups. Karahan Tepe, excavated beginning in 2019 by a team from Harran University led by Necmi Karul, has produced carved heads, including a realistic human head emerging from bedrock, that suggest the Taş Tepeler tradition was even richer in representational imagery than Göbekli Tepe alone indicated. Physical and chemical evidence found at Göbekli Tepe, including the remains of large stone vessels, animal bones in extraordinary quantities, and the spatial organization of the enclosures, supports the interpretation that this site was not a settlement, but a gathering place. A location where groups of hunter-gatherers from a wide surrounding region came together periodically for communal activities that archaeologists broadly characterize as ritual. Large limestone basins carved from single blocks of stone have been found at the site. Chemical analysis of their residues, conducted by researchers including Oliver Dietrich of the German Archaeological Institute, has identified the organic signatures of plant-based fermented beverages, consistent with ancient beer or similar preparations. The largest of these basins would have held approximately 150 litres, suggesting production for communal consumption rather than individual use. The quantity of animal bones at the site, representing tens of thousands of individual animals, including large quantities of auroch and gazelle, documents feasting on a scale that could not have been sustained by a single resident community, but is consistent with recurring large gatherings of people from a broader region. The isotope signatures of some animal bones at Göbekli Tepe indicate that the animals were brought from distances of many kilometers, rather than hunted immediately near the site. Evidence of coordinated provisioning for communal events. DNA analysis of plant remains associated with the site has confirmed the presence of wild einkorn wheat, a species whose domesticated descendant, Triticum monococcum, was first cultivated in the immediately surrounding region. The relationship between the demands of feeding a large construction workforce and the beginning of deliberate grain cultivation is one of the most discussed hypotheses in the current Göbekli Tepe literature. Zooarchaeological and isotope evidence found at Göbekli Tepe documents the diet and subsistence economy of the site's builders in enough detail to reconstruct both what they ate and what the logistical demands of their ritual gatherings implied for the development of food production in the ancient Near East. The animal bone assemblage from Göbekli Tepe is dominated by wild species: auroch, red deer, gazelle, and wild boar, with no evidence of domesticated livestock at the site's earliest levels. The quantity of bones is extraordinary. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of individual animals over the centuries of the site's use. The pattern is consistent with large-scale communal hunting and feasting events, rather than everyday domestic consumption. DNA analysis of animal bones from Göbekli Tepe and neighboring sites has contributed to the broader study of animal domestication origins. Genetic research on modern cattle populations, combined with ancient DNA from auroch specimens, has established that all domestic cattle are descended from a founding population of wild auroch, domesticated in the Fertile Crescent approximately 10,000 years ago, in the same region and the same time period as the Göbekli Tepe complex. Whether the ritual demands of sites like Göbekli Tepe directly stimulated domestication by creating the logistical need for reliable local food supplies, or whether domestication and ritual architecture were parallel developments driven by the same broader social changes, remains an active research question. The builders' own health, inferred from the skeletal remains of the period, shows a population with lower rates of dental caries, more robust bone development, and fewer chronic disease markers than the farming populations that would replace them. A pattern consistent with the well-documented health advantages of dietary diversity in pre-agricultural populations. Physical evidence found at a construction site in the modern city of Şanlıurfa, approximately 15 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe, in 1993 includes the oldest known life-sized stone sculpture of a human being. A figure carved from limestone in a posture of formal frontality, with arms folded across its torso and eyes inlaid with polished black obsidian. The Urfa man, as the figure is known, stands approximately 1.8 meters tall. It was found without a context that allowed precise dating, but its style, material, and the geographical and temporal proximity to Göbekli Tepe place it within the same broad cultural tradition. The figure has no mouth, an absence that, combined with the polished obsidian eyes, creates an expression that is watchful and formal rather than communicative. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized across the ancient Near East for its extraordinary sharpness and reflective surface, would have given the figure eyes that caught light in ways that ordinary stone could not. A deliberate optical choice by craftspeople who clearly understood the expressive possibilities of their materials. What can genetics contribute to understanding the people who made the Urfa man? The ancient DNA from the Anatolian hunter-gatherer population provides a biological profile of the individuals within whose cultural world this sculpture was created. Facial reconstruction from genetic data, combining pigmentation gene variants, bone morphology, and comparative analysis, produces an approximation of how these people looked. Medium to dark skin, consistent with a population not yet under selective pressure for lighter pigmentation, dark eyes, and the facial morphology of the early Anatolian genetic cluster. The Urfa man is displayed at the Şanlıurfa Archaeology Museum, the oldest known portrait of a human being, made by people whose DNA we can now partially read. Archaeological evidence found in the fill layers of Göbekli Tepe's enclosures, deposited in a process that appears to have begun around 8000 BCE and continued over several centuries, documents one of the most deliberately strange events in the entire archaeological record of the ancient world: the intentional burial, by the people who had been using the site, of the very structures they had built. The backfill is not natural accumulation. It consists of broken flint tools, animal bones, stone fragments, and soil that was clearly transported to the site and deliberately used to fill the enclosures to the tops of the pillars. The T-pillars were not knocked down or dismantled. They were buried upright, encased in the fill material that preserved them for 12,000 years. The deliberate and careful nature of the burial is documented by the consistency of the fill composition and the absence of any evidence of the kind of rapid, catastrophic deposition that a natural collapse or emergency abandonment would produce. Why it happened is the most debated question in current Göbekli Tepe research. The leading proposals include deliberate ritual closure of enclosures to mark the end of a ceremonial cycle, with new enclosures opened nearby. A response to changing religious conditions that made existing structures obsolete. Or a practice of consecrating the site by sealing it. The pattern of continued construction in new areas, while earlier enclosures were filled, supports the interpretation of an ongoing living tradition, rather than a single catastrophic abandonment. The DNA evidence documents that the population associated with the site continued in the surrounding region after the burial. The builders were not displaced or destroyed. They simply stopped using the site in the ways they had before. Science Hypothesis, published in peer-reviewed journals beginning in 2007 and continuing through 2022, has proposed that a comet or asteroid impact or airburst event approximately 12,800 years ago, at the onset of a climate cooling period called the Younger Dryas, caused widespread fires, crop failures, and megafauna extinctions across the Northern Hemisphere, and may have been one of the triggers that forced the human communities of the Near East toward the intensive land use that led to agriculture. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, as it is known, draws on evidence including elevated concentrations of platinum, iridium, and nanodiamonds at the Younger Dryas boundary layer in sediment records from sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. These chemical signatures are consistent with an extraterrestrial impact, though alternative terrestrial explanations for each have also been proposed. The hypothesis remains contested. A 2018 meta-analysis by a large research team found supporting evidence from multiple sites, while other researchers have challenged the statistical methods and the significance of individual lines of evidence. The connection to Göbekli Tepe comes through a 2017 paper by Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis, published in Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry, which proposed that the animal carvings on Pillar 43, the so-called vulture stone, encode astronomical information and may represent a record of a comet impact visible in approximately 10,950 BCE. The interpretation has not achieved consensus among archaeologists or archaeoastronomers, but it has generated substantial scientific discussion and illustrates the complexity of interpreting symbolic systems whose cultural context is not directly recoverable. Population genetic research, published across multiple journals between 2015 and 2023, has traced the biological legacy of the Göbekli Tepe builders through one of the most consequential demographic movements in human history: the spread of Anatolian farming populations into Europe beginning approximately 9,000 years ago, carrying with them the agricultural practices, ceramic traditions, and genetic profiles that transformed the continent. The ancient DNA evidence for this process is now extremely detailed. Studies sampling hundreds of ancient individuals from sites across Anatolia, southeastern Europe, Central Europe, and northwestern Europe show a consistent pattern. The arrival of Anatolian ancestry farmers in each region is associated with a genetic discontinuity, a substantial replacement of the Western hunter-gatherer ancestry that had characterized Europe since the first modern human arrival. The incoming farmers carried a distinctive genetic signature that traces directly to the Anatolian hunter-gatherer population, the same population associated with Göbekli Tepe and the Taş Tepeler sites. Karahan Tepe, currently under active excavation and dated to the same period as Göbekli Tepe, or possibly earlier, has already produced carved human heads with more realistic facial anatomy than anything found at Göbekli Tepe, including one striking sculpture of a head emerging directly from the bedrock, as if the stone itself were giving birth to a human face. These discoveries suggest that the artistic and architectural tradition of the Taş Tepeler complex was both longer-lasting and more spatially extensive than the initial excavations of Göbekli Tepe suggested. Ancient DNA sampling from Karahan Tepe is ongoing and will add to the genetic portrait of the population responsible for this tradition. A population whose biological legacy, the farming migration into Europe, was one of the most consequential demographic events in the history of the continent. Science synthesis found across the archaeological, genetic, and paleo-environmental literature on Göbekli Tepe and the Taş Tepeler complex presents an argument that has become, over the 30 years since Klaus Schmidt's first excavations, the most consequential revision in the history of our understanding of human prehistory. The argument that complex collective religious and architectural activity preceded and may have driven the agricultural revolution. The standard model of 20th century prehistory held that the sequence was fixed: agriculture first, surplus second, settled life third, religion and monumental architecture fourth. Göbekli Tepe inverts this entirely. The monument is there before the agriculture. The organizing principle that brought hundreds of people together to quarry, transport, and erect 20-ton limestone pillars was not the surplus of a farming community. It was shared belief and shared ritual, whatever its specific content. Only approximately 5% of the Göbekli Tepe site has been excavated. The geomagnetic survey data published by the German Archaeological Institute indicates the presence of at least 20 additional enclosures beneath the surface, none of them yet opened. The Taş Tepeler project as a whole, coordinating excavation at multiple related sites across southeastern Turkey, has already demonstrated that Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated anomaly, but the best preserved expression of a cultural tradition that extended across a significant geographic area for thousands of years. The DNA of the people who built it flows through the populations of Europe and the Near East. The questions they built their monuments to engage, questions about the sky, about death, about the powers that governed human life, are questions that have not gone away.